We'll go to the Daily Telegraph first, over here.
Bruno Waterfield, Daily Telegraph. When the communiques and texts were first circulated for this discussion today, Britain was very concerned because the word NATO hardly featured at all, and Britain is concerned that some of these defence discussions do not feature NATO as the primary source of Europe's defence. Is that a concern that you share?
Obviously, I'm not going to interfere with European Union deliberations on Council conclusions. What I can say is that NATO is and will remain the bedrock of EuroAtlantic security. And actually, I don't see any contradiction between a strengthened defense in Europe and a strong NATO. On the contrary, if European nations decide to invest more in critical capabilities like observation drones, air-to-air refueling and heavy transport, it will also make their contribution to NATO stronger. So a strong Europe also means a strong NATO.
DPA.
Yeah, detailing with DPA, the German press agency. Secretary General, the British Prime Minister said Europe doesn't need more capabilities, Europe needs more cooperation, but no capabilities. Can we assume that you had a very serious word with Mr. Cameron about his opinion that no further capabilities are needed?
We had an excellent exchange of views after my intervention today. If I understand your question correctly, it's about who owns the capabilities. I'm speaking about European nations. I think European nations need to invest in critical capabilities because during our operations we learned where Europeans need more capacity. And that is within observation drones, air-to-air refueling, heavy transport. And I appreciate that the European Council will also focus on some of these critical capability areas. So I'm not speaking about NATO possessing military capabilities or the European Union possessing military capabilities. I'm speaking about the need for nations to do more to acquire much needed military capabilities.
Lady over there.
Yes.
Bonjour, Léonore Hubot pour Bruxelles 2. J'aurais voulu vous demander, est-ce que vous pensez qu'une intervention européenne en RCA est nécessaire? Merci.
Tout d'abord, je vais exprimer mon appréciation pour l'action rapide et déterminée de la France au Mali et en République centrafricaine. Ces opérations sont nécessaires pour lutter contre le terrorisme, pour sauver des vies et en général pour stabiliser notre voisinage. L'instabilité et l'insécurité en Afrique et au Moyen-Orient auront un impact négatif sur l'Europe. Ces régions peuvent devenir des zones de prolifération du terrorisme et du trafic d'armes et de drogue. Et l'Europe va venir sous la pression des réfugiés et les émigrés clandestins. Et c'est pourquoi je salue l'action française. Et laissez-moi souligner que la France n'est pas seul. Plusieurs alliés ont offert leur soutien actif, mais cela dit, nous avons besoin plus de pays comme la France avec la capacité et la volonté d'agir.
You're active over here.
Gary Gotev, you're active. Secretary General, your answer in French convinced me that you answer to all possible requirements to get a top EU job. Your mandate finishes the next year, and there will be plenty of top EU jobs for grabs. Are you a candidate for any of them?
But actually, right now, I'm very much focused on the upcoming NATO summit, which will take place at the beginning of September next year. So I have not started reflections on my personal future after September 2014. Now I will devote all my time and efforts to prepare the Wales summit to ensure a successful outcome of that summit.
James.
Yes, Brooke Singer, Jane's Defense. Developing new capabilities does no good if they can't be rapidly deployed due to lack of money. So I was wondering, should the EU and NATO align their thinking about new ways to make more money available for deployment during operations? And if so, what would your advice to the EU be? Thank you.
I think there are three ways to make more efficient use of scarce resources within security and defense. The first is, of course, to provide more funding, to increase investments in defense. I'm realistic. I do know that in the short term it will be difficult because of the economic crisis, but I appreciate that actually I have seen some NATO allies commit themselves to gradually reverse the trend and move gradually towards the 2% of GDP benchmark for defense investment. So I appeal to nations that once the economies recover, they will also provide more funds for defense and security. So that's, of course, the first way. Secondly, I think, in particular in the short term, it is necessary to get more value for money, make more efficient use of resources through more multinational cooperation. We call it smart defense within the European Union. We call it pooling and sharing, but it's two sides of the same coin that individual nations will see it increasingly difficult to acquire the necessary military capabilities. But if we help each other in multinational projects, we can. So I think smart defense is the second way forward to make more efficient use of resources and get more military capabilities. And then finally, the third way is to reallocate resources, to move resources into areas of future-oriented military capabilities. And that's also a reason why I appreciate what I think will be the outcome of the European Council meeting, namely a focus on, for instance, observation drones and air-to-air refueling, because we learned lessons. These are areas where the Europeans need more capacity.
Defence News.
Julian Howe, Defence News. You mentioned one of the areas was enabling a strong European industrial base. What for you was the best of the measures that are being proposed by the EU to improve the European industrial base, and how could NATO work with the EU to help that process? And secondly, on the heavy transport, the observation drones, are you at all concerned? I mean, not all 28 member states are involved in these, and also the timelines are quite a long way off. Are you at all concerned that there'll be big gaps in the meantime?
Speaking about heavy transport, I appreciate that European nations are focusing more and more on providing such heavy air transport. a number of European countries have joined efforts in acquiring, I think, if I remember correctly, it's 170 heavy transport aircrafts, and I highly appreciate that. And the first part of your question, just a key word. Yes, about the industrial policy. First of all, let me stress that it's for the European Union and not NATO to deal with industrial policy. I have read with great interest the Commission communication on the defence industrial policies. Again, I'm not going to interfere with EU decisions, but personally, I do believe that one of the ways to develop a more competitive European defence industry is to open up markets and ensure a more well-functioning internal defence market in Europe.
Gentleman over there.
Thank you. Andrew Byrne, Financial Times. One of the guiding rules of CSDP development was that there should be no duplication. But recently we had a number of anti-piracy missions off the Gulf of Somalia. There was an EU NAV4 mission and there was a NATO mission. Don't you think that such missions, if they're doing essentially the same thing, should be either run as CSDP missions or as NATO missions rather than duplication side by side?
Our counter-piracy missions are not duplicating each other. Actually, I think they complement each other because NATO can also bring to bear certain capacities that are not at the disposal of the European Union. But I agree that we need close coordination and cooperation, and actually our cooperation as regards counter-piracy works very, very well. And as you also know, the joint international counter-piracy operation has been quite successful. Long ago we saw the last successful piracy attack. Personally, I think we still need counter-piracy operations as a deterrence.
One last question, lady over there.
Thank you. Tina Friedrich, ARD Radio. Hi, I'm here. My question is not so much about defense policy, but more about strategy concerning Ukraine. Mr. Schulz just said in the press conference that he thinks that within a year, the opinion of Ukraine might change again and lean towards the European Union instead of Russia. Where do you see the strategic way for Ukraine in this case?
First of all, I would like to stress that we fully respect Ukraine's right to decide independently and freely their alliance affiliation and their relations with international organizations. I think that's an inherent principle that each individual nation has a right to freely choose. Having said that, seen from my perspective, there is no doubt that the future of Ukraine lies within close cooperation with our EuroAtlantic organizations, the European Union and NATO. And speaking about NATO, you will recall that back in 2008 we actually stated at the NATO summit that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Of course, provided that they fulfill the necessary criteria and provided that Ukraine so wishes. Since then, the political leadership in Ukraine has pursued, or after the political leadership changed, they have pursued a so-called non-bloc policy. We fully respect that, but we also appreciate that Ukraine has decided to continue its close practical cooperation with NATO within the NATO-Ukraine Commission. And actually, Ukraine is a very active contributor to all NATO-led military operations as well as the NATO response force. And recently, Ukraine also participated in a huge NATO exercise. So seen from that perspective, we have an ongoing, very active cooperation with Ukraine, and I hope to see that cooperation further flourish in the coming years.
Thank you very much.